back by unpopular demand, me!
Last time, we covered the first handful of games that introduced Spider-Man to the world of gaming. With all of these initial attempts hitting a new level of horrible, it possibly can get worse, is something I would say if I didn't cover the handheld games first. The only game that's an excuse to be bad is the Atari 2600 game because it was the first Spider-Man game to exist. But with the help of Neosci, we'll be tackling the amazing and not so amazing Adventures of Spider-Man in the 16-bit era. So, what are we covering first?
My ass is fat as hell, holy shit.
Developed by Technopop and published by Sega, The Amazing Spider-Man vs. the Kingpin still sucks. Despite that, it was still advertised besides Sonic the Hedgehog and Streets of Rage, so there has to be something good about it. What made this game a console seller alongside Sonic and Streets of Rage? Well, the game looks pretty good. The models are really detailed, and while the backgrounds aren't that complex, they are pleasing to the eyes. Although, Spider-Man's chest pattern doesn't exist, which is weird, then again it could have been whatever the hell this was, so we were temporarily spared. All hail the mighty Sega, may you live on till the end of time. Oh my god, what the fuck.
Hey pal, you just blowing from Stupid Town?
The music isn't assaulting my ears, and for the most part, it's pretty decent. It's definitely a Sega Genesis soundtrack, with how jazzy the music sounds. The jungle theme sounds like something you hear in a documentary, so my headphones were on most of the time. The game comes with a comic that explains the content of the game, and the art's great. It's pretty much the intro cutscene, but with an additional battle with Doc Ock. For some reason, they made Spider-Man really unhinged and I ended up cackling like a gremlin. Speaking of the intro cutscene, each boss and Kingpin encounter is bookended with a cutscene. They range from a wall of text with Spider-Man pacing around, to still images with a wall of text. When Mary Jane is kidnapped by Venom, there is a traditional cutscene and I love all of it. Although the art style is inconsistent. It ranges from John Romita Sr. to Tom McFarlane with a bit of the 90s cartoon. And the 90s cartoon came out after the game came out, which is weird. What really surprised me was the character writing. Spider-Man conveyed his emotions via walls of text, but it captured his voice really well, and that actually allowed me to get immersed into the story. Which is the last shred of positivity I can spare for this game, so let's get into the nitty gritty. The plot of the game has the Kingpin framing Spider-Man for a crime he didn't commit. According to the Kingpin, Spider-Man stole a bomb, and in 24 hours it set to destroy New York City. In order to defuse the bomb, you need to collect keys that are being held by the Sinister Six. At some point, Venom kidnaps Mary Jane, but other than that, you have 24 hours to save the city. Time constraints in video games are the worst thing to pin on the player, but the way that this game does it is probably worse than Majora's Mask. Before and after each level, you end up at Peter's apartment. You can either leave the apartment to start the next level, or heal yourself before jumping back in. But healing yourself wastes time, so you think you can just play it safe, or use the healing items in the level, but those are few and far between. The game gives you an option to go back home at any time to heal up, but if you leave this stage and come back, you're starting from the beginning. No checkpoints are given, and as the game progresses, you realize how much you need them. What about the webs? How do you obtain webs? Webs aren't limited, and unless you find web cartridges, which are as rare as the health items, you're shit out of luck, especially considering you need webs to traverse to certain parts of each level. So if you run out of webs, you can be soft locked from completing the game. What's worse is that it's hard to create momentum when the levels where you need them the most are at best claustrophobic. I was able to get to the final level when I ran out of webs, which soft locked me from beating the game, so that's when I threw in the gloves. You may have noticed that I didn't answer the question that I asked, and it was on purpose. Okay, so Spider-Man has power-ups. They are a spider shield, your normal webs, the Peter Parker icon, which returns you home, and a camera. Throughout each level, you're expected to take pictures of enemies and bosses in order to rack up cash. So when the level ends, the money you earned refills your web fluid. And I would have never known this if I didn't watch a video on YouTube. What frustrates me more than anything is that you would have never known this unless you looked it up online or read the manual. Many people either play this game only having the cartridge or playing it through emulation. So this important aspect of the game is pretty much hidden and it's frustrating. The game expects a lot from the player, and on top of what I mentioned already, it gets worse. The lack of healing items and checkpoints makes these levels borderline unplayable. Certain levels have you fighting 2 to 3 bosses either at the same time or in succession, which means this game is inflated with trial and error. Usually, trial and error entice the player to keep playing, but with all these barriers in place, it's hard to justify going forward after getting your first game over. I mean, sure, it's hilarious that Spider-Man is placed in a cell and decking a cop allows him to escape, but with the aforementioned barriers and difficulty spikes, the game gets frustrating really fast. The only time I was able to gain a foothold was the off chances where I found boss exploits. For example, the web shield is great to use against Doc Ock, and you can stun lock Electro and Venom with your webs. I've played this game many times over, and it won't be the last time in this video, but this version of the game had a lot of potential with its visuals and music, but the mechanics and structure of the game hold it back and can sour the overall experience. The Amazing Spider-Man vs. the Kingpin on the Sega Genesis is a 2.5 out of 5. This is not the first or last time that Sega backed the wrong horse. Anyway, developed by Software Creations and published by popular punching bag LJN, Spider-Man and the X-Men in Arcade's Revenge has a great soundtrack. A great example of how a great soundtrack can carry a game that is otherwise garbage. If it wasn't for the music, I probably would have got this game much faster. But each stage provided music that motivates you to keep trying, and it's something I want to use in future videos because music is really good and I love it. Other than great music, the game presents its cutscenes by using comic book panels, and that's really cool. When I played the handheld version of this game, I really hated how you had to play the intro level every time you got a game over. But once you complete the intro level in the Genesis version, you can skip it after you get your first game over. Apparently that option didn't exist on the Super Nintendo version, which is weird. I guess Sega really does when Nintendo don't. I'm dead inside. The intro level in this version is much more tolerable, and the only level where it doesn't feel overwhelming. You have time and adequate space to try Spider-Man now, and the game feels intuitive. You can create momentum by moving the D-pad, and it's not frustrating. The only thing that bothered me is that the spider sense has a short range, which made getting each bomb a bit tedious. The game itself looks pretty alright, but what I want to gush about is Spider-Man's sprint work. First of all, they added his spider chest so as a point above the Amazing Spider-Man vs. the Kingpin. Second of all, the amount of details given to his movements is insane. When he's crawling up somewhere, you can see how his body contorts and it's just really cool. But despite the music, the ability to skip the intro level, and the sprite work, the game was published by LJN and it definitely shows. The basic plot is that while swinging across New York City, as he does, Spider-Man sees Gambit getting kidnapped by some weird truck, Green Day style. Spider-Man defuses bombs and finds out that the X-Men have been kidnapped by Arcade, an X-Men villain who's basically Jigsaw. Spider-Man and the X-Men have to survive Murder World and take down Arcade once and for all. After the introduction level, you have a choice to either play as Spider-Man, Wolverine, Cyclops, Storm, and Gambit. Each level provides different experiences in a variety of different environments, but we have to talk about the elephant in the room, Storm's level. For some reason, they gave Storm, a character who can control the weather, a water level. Water levels are considered the worst aspect of any game they're featured in. The level of disrespect is on a whole other level. It includes every frustrating aspect of a water level, which includes pesky oxygen conservation, a confusing map layout, and trial and error that frustrates you in ways you never knew were possible, which explains the majority of every other level. Usually you get the hang of things, but every step of the way I felt both overwhelmed and confused. Pro Jared said that the Storm level was the easiest due to a lack of a health system, but it didn't help that I got lost constantly, and when I felt I was progressing, something would get in the way. If it wasn't for the fact that I could skip the intro level, I would have just stopped then and there. But even with the hours I spent trying to gain a foothold, the game never budged and I never felt like I was getting better at it. The game has good things going for it, but the frustrating gameplay and level design just leaves you feeling a bit bitter. Spider-Man and the X-Men in Arcade's Revenge gets a 2.5 out of 5. Developed by Western Technologies and published by Acclaim, Spider-Man, they really have to stop making these games just Spider-Man, is an action side-scroller that's based on the animated series from the 90s. This is a game that I remember having alongside my hand-me-down Sega Genesis. It was a game that I constantly misplaced, and to this day I still have no idea where it is. All I remember is that it was confusing and there were a lot of Spider-Man villains. So now that I'm playing this game, does that initial impression hold up? Yeah. To start off with a positive, it's awesome that they were able to use the entirety of the theme song. I didn't think that hearing a 16-bit version of Spider Blood, Radioactive Spider Blood will make me smile, but it did. The story is pretty simple. The Green Goblin, Alistair Smythe, the Ultimate Spider Slayer, Dr. Octopus, and the alien Spider Slayer. If you forgot, that was that weird xenomorph looking alien from the third Game Boy Spider-Man game. They escaped the Ravencroft Institute, the Marvel Universe version of Arkham Asylum, and plan to take over New York City. So Spider-Man, you, has to stop these sinister foes that aren't in a 6 formation before they destroy the city for the upteenth time. My initial impression was that this game was confusing, and after playing the entire game, I can say that it's not just confusing, it's ridiculously confusing. The intro level is pretty easy to wrap your head around. You defeat a bunch of cyborg enemies, and then after defeating a robot, you can lead to the next stage. The first issue you encounter is your run speed. Spider-Man's normal walking speed is a full sprint, which leads you to ramming into enemies head first without a moment to stop before you take damage. In order to not do that, you have to run and stop, which becomes increasingly frustrating. Once you begin to fight enemies, that creates the next issue you'll encounter. Fighting enemies one-on-one is fruitless because you'll end up taking more damage and wasting time. You can stun lock enemies, but it's usually not worth the risk unless you really have to. Fortunately, Spider-Man can perform a jump kick that takes out enemies in one hit. Even when you deal with stronger enemies later on, it gives you a better advantage and damage output. What pissed me off the most were these robot spiders that would explode if you defeated them, because that explosion would damage you too. If you hit it, it damages you, and if you web it to death, it will damage you. If you're 1 pixel near the blast radius, it will also do damage. They're too fast, so no matter what you do, you're going to take damage. Spider-Man has 2 types of grenades, stun and gas grenades. Logic dictates that you use them against enemies, but it's better to save them for boss encounters. Even your webs aren't really that useful, and other than regular webs, there are also these orange webs that do a bit of damage. Webs are useful for 2 things. Either they give you space between enemies, or swing around in the rare times you have to. Swinging is pretty weird. So instead of your webs immediately attaching themselves to wherever it hits, you have to time it. You have to jump, wait for a second, and then shoot a web so it can attach itself to the spot where it registers it. Webbing can allow you to traverse areas to find extra items, but its actual appliance is used in one area. The act of swinging is easy to get accustomed to, but actually doing split-second web slinging while trying to fall into an area where you get run over by a roller coaster or being hit by enemies was nerve-wracking. That was an area where you drained a lot of lives. Other power-ups range from health items to spider armor, which allows you to take a bit of damage without losing your health. Health pickups vary from normal health items to restore a bit of your health, to items that can completely restore your health, webs, and grenades. The last power-ups are these fantastic 4 tokens that allow you to summon them for assistance. The Human Torch wipes your screen of enemies, the Thing clobbers things, the Invisible Woman and Mr. Fantastic offer a shield from damage or health restoration. I was only able to find the Human Torch token, which was in the sewer area. At first, I thought the area was a level with a boss fight, but it just has a bunch of power-ups hidden around with enemies around at every corner. You can defeat the Lizard, but that's temporary. He turns back to Dr. Connors, and that gives you a window of time to either leave or hunt for more items. The coolest thing about this area is that there's an opening in front of a power-up. Once you get the power-up, a pair of eyes appear behind you, and then fire is spat out. This level of detail adds to how great the game looks, but I'll get into that in a bit. The sewer area is what initially confused me when starting up the game. You complete the first level and then you go to the second segment of the level. You have to press down and the jump button to leave the background and enter the foreground. I'll also talk about that later. If you go to the left, you enter the sewer area, and if you go to the right, you fight Dr. Octopus. This is why I was confused and thought it was maybe a hub area, but in the level after defeating Doc Ock, you can go to the sewers again somehow, which I still can't wrap my head around. But let's talk about the presentation before I start rambling again. The game itself looks amazing. There are these cool lighting effects and there's pixelated blood in a Spider-Man game, which is pretty neat. The character sprites look awesome, and there's a lot of detail in every model. Either it's the idle animations that bring both Spider-Man and his cast of villains to life, or even the sculpting of these models. Like, look at Spider-Man for instance, he's fucking jacked. He has his normal muscles, but there are these ridiculously detailed side muscles. My only complaint is that, where's the chest spider? And the lining on his suit? It's quite literally the oddest detail that they omitted from his model. I'm used to it not being there, but this model is sculpted in great detail, so now it's kind of inexcusable. What makes it worse is that Venom has his chest spider that even stretches to his side muscles and the 2 spots on his hands. So if they were able to do that for Venom, why not Spider-Man? Also, to get a bit sussy for a second, why does Venom have a massive pixelated bulge? Venom has a 50 pack with his massive schlong bulging from his suit in 16-bit. I mean, Spider-Man 3 had Thickum, but now he's sporting the Glizzy Deluxe. Then again, Venom back then wanted to be better than Spider-Man, so in this instance, I guess he won? Alright, I'll stop being sussy and get back to talking about this game and not Venom's. The levels have literal depth, as you have to switch between the foreground and the background to traverse environments. At first, you'll be walking back and forward, confused and stuck, but if you just press up and jump or down and jump, you can enter different areas and platforms in the background. I wish that this game showed you that you can move between the foreground and the background. Maybe like an arrow or something? But once you figure it out, you've solved 1/3 of the confusion. The silver lining is that this game is somewhat fair, and gives you more space to make mistakes than Arcade's Revenge. That space is the fact that levels are broken down into segments, and when you enter a segment, that acts as a checkpoint. If you die in part 2 of level 3, you go back to part 2. Sure, your items are not refilled, but you can go back to where you left off and go from there. If you lose all of your lives, you're not sent back to the beginning of the level, but back to the segment you left off. And your health, grenades, and webs are refilled as well. which is generous. These levels are huge, which lends fine to exploration. And if you look hard enough, you can find shortcuts that lead the bosses faster or provide a break. Exploration has its obvious positives. You can find grenades and web refills or even extra lives, but the biggest con is the number of mini bosses that are littered in these levels. I'd like to preface this with the fact that these are for the most part optional encounters. You could go a level only fighting 1 or 2 of the many mini bosses, but if you don't know that they exist, then you're going to drain all your health and resources fighting a boss that isn't a level boss. That misconception happened on many occasions, and what makes it worse is that some of these mini bosses are mandatory to proceed to the next level segment. That is what makes this game overwhelming. You gotta traverse these big levels with the foreground and background being utilized heavily. It's hard to tell what's obstructing your way. Is it a building I can climb on, or is it just set dressing? There are these enemies that pack quite a punch, which means that you're going to try to jump kick them into oblivion or mistakenly use an item you needed for a boss. Then there are the mini bosses you might unknowingly run into, and if you survive all of that, you'll have to beat the level boss. Overwhelming is the best word I can use, and even as I'm writing this and probably recording this, I can't find another word to explain it. Ambitious sounds wrong, but what I can say is that it feels like a 2D version of an open world Spider-Man game. There's depth like a 3D game, there's a bunch of Spider-Man villains to overcome, and there's an exploration aspect. The problem is that it feels like a 3D game but on a 2D plane. The more I say it, the more I hope it makes sense. Fighting the bosses themselves have no real balance in difficulty. Some of these bosses are easy and the other bosses are hard to telegraph if it's time to hit them or if they're weakened. Most of the time I beat the bosses by luck or when they stopped running at me. Let's talk about the last level because that's when the game kind of broke me. I got to the last level, and despite all the weird shit this game threw at me, which ranged from getting run over by a roller coaster to fighting through the highways of New York City, the last level is in this claustrophobic building where you have to fight a bunch of mini bosses and regular enemies, and then if you got that far, complete a confusing puzzle. Each of the main bosses drop these tablets, and before you enter the final boss area, you have to put these tablets back in place in a specific order. I for the life of me couldn't figure out the order to place them. There are no symbols to signify their placement, and on top of that you're getting attacked by 2 mini bosses that never leave you alone. So a claustrophobic first segment with a bunch of enemies and 2 mini bosses, and a pain in the ass of a second segment with a confusing puzzle and 2 mini bosses breathing down your neck. So I did something I thought I'd never do. I lowered the difficulty setting and replayed the game from the beginning to where I left off.
I hate this channel.
The game does allow you to change the number of lives you start with, but the difficulty options make or break the game. When I lowered the difficulty, I then understood what the game was going for, and I liked it more on that playthrough. It was still difficult, but fair to the player. Anyway, after one YouTube search later, I figured out the puzzle and encountered the final boss, Venom the Second. I thought the previous bosses were ridiculous to some extent, but this is quite literally the worst boss in the entire game. Your webs push them back but do no damage, your grenades do no damage, and your punches do no damage. I haven't used the Fantastic Four token because I didn't have it anymore, but if I had it, it probably wouldn't have worked either. So how do you defeat Venom the Second? You have to wait until he jumps, and somehow calculate the distance between him and your long jump, then you have to play the long game until you win. Why? Who made it like this? Are you okay? This is by far the stupidest way to beat a boss. The final boss takes all the skills learned throughout your experience and acts as a final test, but this final boss is just a test of patience and luck. At one point I decided to just jump on a platform and try to cheese the fight, but Venom's AI somehow adapted to it and moved around it. But despite that, I was able to beat him after what felt like 20 years, and then the game just ends. The credits do a "Where Are They Now" for the villains, and it was pretty hilarious all things considered, but that's Spider-Man, or Spider-Man the Animated Series game. I don't hate it whatsoever. Despite its flaws that are constantly slapping around, I did find some enjoyment in playing this game. Learning the rhythm, looking at the great art, enjoying the game here and there, and putting on some headphones that distracted me from this mid-soundtrack. Sure, there are bona fide bangers, but some of these tracks made me want to slam my head onto the wall. With every great sounding track on the list, there was an equally bad track that sounded like a cacophony of noises. The weird part is that some tracks will start with a painful set of noises and then start sounding like quality Genesis music. It reminded me of a certain anime/manga that people keep saying I should watch. Also, it's probably the first game to advertise something insane and be accurate. The commercial promised a bunch of enemies that Spider-Man can't handle even with help, and that's how I felt playing it.
No need to panic. Could be critical. The odds are against you. Spider-Man faces 20 supervillains so powerful even with the Fantastic Four. His number may be up. Marvel's Spider-Man, the video game from Acclaim.
But with all that being said, I would definitely recommend this one, and it's something I'll go back to sometime in the future. Spider-Man gets a 3.5 out of 5. And if you're having a hard time with the game, or suck at games in general, I'm going to give you the best advice no other YouTuber will give you. Use save states. But you didn't hear that from me.
Sorry.
The Amazing Spider-Man Web of Fire was released for Sega's 32X add-on for the Sega Genesis in 1996. This game is a side-scrolling brawler, and the entire idea behind it is that Hydra has overtaken New York and put a giant laser web above the city. Visually, this game has a pretty unique style, well, at first. Characters all look like they were 3D models converted to 2D animation, but it's got this very specific kind of charm to it that actually still looks pretty cool today. The early environments even have that same pseudo 3D style, and it's just a nice consistent look overall. When you move around, there's this nice parallax effect in the background, and for example, in the rooftop levels, you can see buildings move and change perspective in the background as you move. This gives an actual sense of scale in an otherwise flat 2D game. Of course, not everything looks this dynamic in every level, and as time goes on, it seems like they become less and less dynamic and unique. But we can still acknowledge how good the first level looks, and it does maintain that presentation most of the way through the rest of the game. The controls are fine. They're straightforward enough, and I can't really complain too much about them. You have the option to jump, punch, climb walls and ceilings, and shoot webs. Jumping twice allows you to web swing, and using any kind of web action uses some of your web reserve, which has to be refilled by finding little web refills around the levels. There's an extra mechanic here where if you save Daredevil in the first level, you get these Daredevil tokens that allow you to summon him and do a big screen wipe attack at the cost of 1 token. You can rarely find these tokens in later levels too. The Daredevil support isn't super useful though, to be perfectly honest. Usually there's not enough of a concentration of enemies on the screen for it to be super useful, and he can't really do a whole lot to hurt bosses either. Something I want to complain about though are some of the dumb, seemingly intentionally broken enemy and environmental encounters in this game. The enemies are simple enough, mostly composed of grunts and various kinds of robots, but the rules they follow are much different than the rules Spider-Man follows. I know this is an older game, but hear me out. The grunts can fire projectiles both through each other to hit you and through the environment to hit you. You can't shoot your webs through the environment. This, to me, is a huge gameplay sin that just causes nothing but frustration. There's also these segments throughout the levels where you run into obstacles that are completely unavoidable unless you've played this game before and can remember the exact placement of the obstacles. On top of that, sometimes the game sticks a bunch of obstacles all in one area. For example, there are these fire plumes that fire straight up every few seconds. The problem is, if you want to avoid an enemy attack, you have to jump right around them or swing past them, and you're more than likely to get hit. Plus, for some ridiculous reason, Spider-Man can climb on them, and it almost always happens at the most inopportune times, and you never do it on purpose. It constantly damages him as he climbs on it until you can mash buttons to jump off, and even then, trying to get off just makes him crawl on top of it 9 times out of 10. Want to get creative and crawl on the ceiling to bypass these obstacles? Nah, the developers thought of that. They put random robot missile enemies that can knock you down, sometimes directly over a fire plume. Oh, and this happens even if you defeat the enemy first. They exist solely as an inconvenient fun killer. The boss fights aren't really much better. The bosses include Dragon Man and the Eel, but really these fights just feel underwhelming. Your webbing does basically nothing to them save for a tiny, less than a second stun that you can't really take advantage of. So your only real options are just to punch them repeatedly as they hit you, or find some other way to cheese them. Well, you could also call in Daredevil, but again, that's not really that useful here either. As far as music goes, this game is like the poster child for something that a lot of Genesis and 32X games do that actually kind of bothers me. The music seems to be overwhelmingly just metal scraping noises. The main theme for the first level is actually the biggest perpetrator here. It's got this cool bass drum and snare sound in the background, but it just sounds like someone took nails and scraped it against various pieces of metal and called it the soundtrack. Don't get me wrong, there are some decent tracks in this game, but the soundtrack is dominated by this metal scraping noise. I think it's meant to represent an electric guitar or something? It was the style at the time for these games, especially on Sega consoles, but I don't personally think it's aged that well, at least not in this game. All of these factors combined sometimes make this game feel like ripping out teeth to play. When I first started, I was actually stoked because I thought I was in for a pretty fun time based on just the first level, but no! It just got worse and worse as time went on. Fortunately, I found out that the game isn't super long, probably around an hour if you take your time. Unfortunately, that's still entirely too long for a game like this. I feel like this game could have been good. Had they designed the levels a little bit better and tweaked how enemies can interact with the environment, it could have actually been a cool gem that was fun to play. Unfortunately for me, it's just a big example of wasted potential. If I had to give this game a rating, I'd give it points for presentation, at least at first, but the gameplay leaves a lot to be desired. In that case, I definitely give it a 2 out of 5, solely for the presentation.
Thanks, Neosai. I expect a restraining order in 3 to 5 business days. I can't believe this game goes for a lot of money, but to quote a great man,
one man's trash is another man's treasure.
Spider-Man and Venom Maximum Carnage was developed by friends at Software Creations and published by Acclaim Entertainment with some LJN in the mix. Software Creations previously worked on Arcade's Revenge, and with Maximum Carnage, they made an arcade game. That sounded better in my head. But Maximum Carnage is considered a quintessential Spider-Man game, and I was most excited to cover this game for this video. Maximum Carnage is based on the Spider-Man event of the same name, and with 14 issues worth of source material, the game is pretty accurate. The story is that Carnage broke out of the Ravencroft Institute and assembles a group of sinister foes to wreak havoc upon New York City, with the goal of killing Spider-Man and the New Yorkers that get in his way, creating Maximum Carnage. Taking the story at face value, that sounds like any of the other Spider-Man games I've covered in this video. It's literally the plot of the last game I covered, but this uses the story to build the game that you're playing, while including the nuances that make a story rich. The game incorporates Maximum Carnage's huge cast of characters and the interactions between them. This attention to detail leads to the game feeling cinematic at times, and that's elevated due to the game's presentation. The game presents a story in 2 ways. There are the obvious cutscenes that digitize the comic book panels with some movement here and there, kind of like a motion comic. The other way is scripted gameplay moments, where a loss in a boss battle or getting a boss to a certain health percentage will trigger a cutscene, which makes the game more engaging and cinematic as I've mentioned earlier. I don't play a lot of beat-em-ups, so it was cool seeing this, especially considering its ties to the source material. It leans into how epic of a story this is, and it just shows the love and attention that these devs gave this game. The sound design is also great. Punching enemies or knowing me getting my ass jumped by the walking human targets and TikTok girls never sounded better. That should have been on the box art. Spider-Man and Venom, Maximum Carnage. Getting jumped has never sounded better. On top of the great sound work, the soundtrack is legendary. It was produced by the rock band Green Jelly, and it's just rock songs on the Genesis, and it's awesome. It's the best music to have while beating the shit out of people. Not that I would know. Obviously, it sounds cleaner on the Super Nintendo, but even on the Genesis, the soundtrack is really good and very 90s. Each track gets you excited to fight the countless waves of crazy New Yorkers and supervillains. I think that's every nice thing I can say about the game. It looks great, it sounds great. But the game itself is where I found the LGN-isms, and it peaked its ugly head in that N64 Mario Party kind of way. First of all, playing this game with a 3-button Genesis controller is absolutely dreadful, and for a klutz like me I ended up hurting my thumb not once, but twice. I knew going into this that the Sega Genesis was not the best way to play games like this, but I didn't think that I would actually get hurt. But that's me. From a technical perspective, the game has these super moves and summons that don't translate well to the controller. In order to cycle through the summons, you have to lightly tap the pause button, which is stupid, but is due to the controller's limitations. Then in order to summon heroes, you have to press all 3 buttons at once, which works when it wants to. If you want to do a super move, you have to also press those buttons at once, and even that barely works. You'll end up jumping and getting slapped around. Also, the summon actions are weird. Black Cat attacks wherever you're standing instead of the whole screen, which means you can miss enemies. what's the point of using a summon if it's specific to a grid? With the controller being an issue to the actual gameplay, that can lead you to getting ganged up, which is frustrating. You can jump around, but that's not fun, and at that point I just kept going forward in order to see the cutscenes. The game became cheaper, and at times I just wanted to stop and read the book instead, which sat on my bookshelf. Each stage has a boss, and usually it's just some random citizen who is superpowered. There are these Visco girls, Bobby Hill, and Umbrella Men. Of course, these boss characters became regular enemies over time, but with a huge cast that's shown in the intro of the game, it feels lazy that they use these stock characters as bosses. You have to break their armor in order to deal real damage, and once you get to that point, you're better off just stone locking them somewhere and cheese the boss fight. They're not challenging in a fun way, and they just feel like a means to an end. These enemies feel like they have the super controller, and they end up doing shit that I can't, which makes no sense. There are moves to perform in this game, but I ended up doing them by mistake, and when I tried to learn how to do things, it never worked out. When you encounter the actual supervillains, they usually attack you in groups, which isn't surprising considering the normie bosses attack in two. Bosses attack you like Mortal Kombat characters. Doppelganger literally beats you down like Goro, and I wonder why. These enemies are the flats to my SpongeBob, and it wears on you over time. I stopped playing at the Prospect Park level because they threw too many enemies at me and it got overwhelming, especially when it's difficult to perform those crouch control moves. That's my main issue with the game. They throw a lot at you, and it gets more difficult and tiresome instead of invigorating. You do have a block button, but it's the same button as the web button, so you'll end up grabbing an enemy instead of blocking. And blocking takes a while to boot up, so you'll end up getting hurt anyway. Blocking has been useful in a handful amount of times, but is not dependable. The game will also throw platforming levels, which are not fun to do. On the second level, you have to climb up and swing between two buildings while Shriek shoots bolts at you, and Doppelganger attacks you if you get high enough. The game thankfully tells you where to go to avoid getting hit, but learning to swing was like trying to perform surgery. So you have to diagonally press the D-pad and the C button to swing, but you also have to press up in order to create momentum. So you're trying to perform momentum-based web slinging while making sure you're in the right spot to swing, while paying attention to the arrow so you won't get hit by Shriek, and also avoiding Doppelganger if you get at a certain height. Then if you fuck up, you drop like a rock all the way down, and at that point you're hoping to hit a part of the scaffolding that you can stand on instead of going straight to the bottom. It's just a huge pain in the ass, and sure, there's a secret room in this level to get extra lives, but activating the secret door works when it wants to, and if it doesn't want to work, you'll end up getting smacked around by Shriek's bolts. There's the second part of the Fantastic Four level where you have to avoid laser doors, and it's not fun either. The last thing I want to touch on is the sprite work. All the villains and heroes look great and have a good amount of detail, but the human enemy and bosses have less detail, which is weird. You have Spider-Man with abs and shading, and when you see one of the human targets, they have flat coloring and no shading. Maybe it was made under a deadline, considering they reuse a lot of enemy models, but you'd assume that they'd make them look as good as the main characters. This could be seen as nitpicking, but I still wanted to point that out. Spider-Man and Venom Maximum Carnage has a lot going for it, in terms of its music and presentation, but its padded out gameplay and difficulty curve due to the controller and design, it's a hard pill to swallow. I understand why it's a cult classic, and I will not say it's a bad game because it's not. It's a decent game with rough edges, and with that I'll give this game a 3.5 out of 5. The game also has Morbius in it, so it's definitely a game you can more about too.
Intriguing.
Developed once again by Software Creations and published by Acclaim, Venom Spider-Man Separation Anxiety is the NBA 2K of beat-em-ups. It's a sequel to a decent game with no real quality of life improvements and often feels inferior to the game that came before it. It starts with the name itself. Maximum Carnage had Spider-Man and Venom in the title because it was one big campaign that allows you to switch between Venom and Spider-Man at key moments in order to flesh out the story. Separation Anxiety has Venom/Spider-Man in the title because the game is just one big campaign that can be played by either character from the story, so that big story component is immediately lost. Maximum Carnage used digitized comic book panels, motion comment techniques, and in-game cutscenes to make the story at least engaging. What did Separation Anxiety do? Separation Anxiety used compressed photos on a black screen with blocks of text. Why? So before you start playing the game, Separation Anxiety has shot itself in the foot. Graphically, it looks vastly different from Maximum Carnage, and it looks fine. The difference slaps you across the face at first, but the 3D-esque backgrounds and the Venom model looks pretty good. The game is fine to look at, but I think Maximum Carnage looked a tad bit better. The music is also really different, changing the rock and roll from Green Jelly to a normal Genesis soundtrack. It's serviceable, but the lack of ambition is sad. The game keeps the standard 3 lives, but removes continues, and that's replaced by a password system. Passwords aren't shown after each stage, but at certain parts of the game. That's frustrating because it takes a while before you get to one of the 3 passwords, and with the gameplay being monotonous, it feels like the kind of game you'll play once and never again, which isn't helped due to the password system. The only bright side about the password system is that you can use cheats to make the game fun. You could also switch between Spider-Man and Venom when you use one of the level passwords, so you can literally play the whole game without playing it twice. Venom has a bulge again, so that's another bright side in an otherwise boring game. People have been critical of Maximum Carnage, but separation anxiety is if you took all the great things that Maximum Carnage brought to the table and flanderized the bullshit. Furthermore, the game is literally the same, but with a different art style, and that ranges from the models and the music performed. Character summons return, and it actually works 100% of the time compared to Maximum Carnage's 75%. Like Maximum Carnage, Separation Anxiety is based on the Venom miniseries of the same name, but that's not true. It's actually based on Venom's first solo miniseries, Lethal Protector. The game takes the Life Foundation, the Jury, the San Francisco setting, and the Life Foundation symbiotes from Lethal Protector. If there are actual ties to Separation Anxiety, it's probably paper thin. Honestly, this feels like a last-ditch attempt to take advantage of the Spider-Man license. And considering that this was the last Spider-Man game developed by Acclaim, that sounds about right. The game adds a Carnage fight at the end, which wasn't a thing in either books, nor is it justified in universe. The only reason why Carnage shows up is because his face is on the box, and it was the 90s, so of course Carnage was there. Venom and Carnage were huge in the 90s, so they could've just made this a Venom game. Spider-Man was just there because Spider-Man makes money, which makes this game feel like a soulless cash grab, which sounds rich considering it's a licensed game. Even the introduction of the Life Foundation symbiotes, Scream, Riot, Agony, Phage, and Lasher, sounds about right for this kind of game. A bunch of empty palace swamps of Venom. I think Scream is the most memorable one, and that's because she was in the Universal Studios ride. The only humorous thing is that Riot looks like Venom from the movie, but without the white veins. I have no idea if modders for this game exist, but they can use them for a Venom fan game, which would be cool. I had more fun imagining this boss as Venom vs Venom than actually playing the game. The bosses for the most part are fine. I thought Lasher was annoying, but not enough to bother me. One of the robot enemies has an enemy icon that's just a recolor of Spider-Man's icon, which adds to this game feeling lazy. One final point, this game, for some fucking reason, has structures that obscure your view. This is a beat 'em up, where you're meant to defeat enemies on the screen. So having things in the foreground that obscures your view so you can get hit easily, it's fucking bullshit, and I'm sick of this game. This game doesn't do anything different, and it flanderizes the flaws of the previous game. If I want to be charitable to this depressing game, I can say that it's fine. Fine. The silver lining is that I want to get a t-shirt or a poster of the cover art because it's fucking awesome. Once again, the game has a Venom bulge, so at least, it has that going for it. Venom / Spider-Man, Separation Anxiety, gets a 2.5 out of 5. I know that this is going to sound ridiculous, but The Amazing Spider-Man vs. the Kingpin on the Sega CD taught me the importance of music in video games. I mean, I know that a soundtrack can impact the game's atmosphere and story, but most of the time I play games with either music or a long video and podcast. But before actually playing the game, I took a look at the soundtrack out of sheer boredom, and it's spectacular. It's awesome. It's such a good soundtrack. A fully composed soundtrack that used the CD and Sega CD to bring life into this game. There's even an original song called Swing Time, and it has the lyrics. Swing time, bring on the breaker. Swing time, knock it trouble out. Now that I got through this batch of games, I was finally going to play a possibly mediocre game with a sensational soundtrack. But then, the Fusion emulator decided to fight back. The game loaded, and when the title screen popped up, there was no music. I thought nothing of it, and when I heard music during the animated cutscenes, yes, you heard me, and we'll talk about that later, I thought it was probably a glitch. Then the first level started, and silence. Each level had all the sound effects without the actual soundtrack, and I was heartbroken. But I just decided to record the game anyway because I wanted to finish this video, and the more I played the game, I got bored. The sound effects were loud and enhanced, which made my playthrough miserable. Every annoying enemy or boss was more frustrating, and after doing the same thing over and over again, I thought that this game was just not good. Another bad game to add to the pile, and another bad version of a game I played many times already. As I gave up hope and spoke to Neosite about the game that I was excited to play just for the music and the animated cutscenes, Neosite came in clutch and helped me set up RetroArch, and after trial and error, mainly on my end, Neosite is an IT king. We got the game to work, and this is what we heard. The Peter Parker the Spectacular music started playing and it got me excited. Now that I had the music, would my opinion of the game change?
Yes! Yes!
The simple answer is yes. But since I'm reviewing the game, let's talk about it. Developed by Grey Matter and published by Sonic Origins botcher Sega, The Amazing Spider-Man vs. the Kingpin on the Sega CD is the best Spider-Man game in the 16-bit era. And while the game has its flaws, like any good game, good or bad, I want to place a spotlight on how amazing this game is. Haha, I'm funny again. As I mentioned, the soundtrack is genuinely great. The game has 13 amazing tracks, and while they are shuffled throughout the levels in Overworld, meaning there's no track specific to a level, they are memorable enough to not get annoying upon repeat. Despite the game coming out in the 90s, it has an 80s sound that's combined with heavy metal. If Spider-Man had a leitmotif in the 90s, I'm convinced that it's heavy metal. It suits him really well, and the soundtrack is an injection of dopamine that has you grinning ear to ear. I know that I've only talked about the soundtrack so far, but it's my favorite thing about the game, as you can already tell. Let's talk about the other way that this game uses the extra horsepower from the CD component, and that's the animated cutscenes. It's not uncommon for Sega CD games to use cutscenes that are either animated or shot in live action like in Night Trap, but whenever you see these cutscenes, they're compromised in some way. Either the animation is slowed down in letterbox, or the FMVs are compressed and weird looking. Spider-Man vs. the Kingpin is the first time I've seen a Sega CD game have uncompromised cutscenes. Sure, the audio sounds odd at times and the music for them never changes, but these are presented well. These cutscenes could have been made with the Sega CD in mind, instead of creating them separately and fitting them onto a CD. So that's probably why they look the way that they do, and if that's the case, I commend Grey Matter for going the extra mile.
Don't count me out yet, Spider-Man!
I don't need spider sense to tell me I haven't seen the last of him.
The actual contents of these cutscenes are interesting for a whole other reason. The art style kinda reminds me of Grandma Got Run Over by a Reindeer if it was done in MS Paint. There are also a lot of reused shots, and Spider-Man's eyes are so big that they go down to his cheekbones. There's also this cheesy song that accompanies these cutscenes, and it doesn't change at all. But with that being said, I really love these cutscenes, and they honestly enrich the experience. I love the weird voice they gave Spider-Man, and the animation in general. Yeah, it looks kinda bad, but there's a love in them that I can't deny. There are a lot of fun and endearing moments that elevate this game more than the soundtrack did already. There are a lot of licensed games that throw stuff haphazardly for consumers to just consume without much thought until those kids grow up and make hour-plus essays years later. So it's honestly refreshing when there's genuine effort put into these games. The fully composed soundtrack does not crunch the bits and cutscenes that tie the story together. It's admirable. Instead of going through the game level by level, the game presents you with an overworld to explore. The overworld allows you to fight crime all over the city and grab any health items and web fluid before going to a boss level. These boss levels are indicated by an animated icon of the villain, which is really cool. Usually 4 levels are around their icons, but the main boss is indicated with a red dot, while the normal levels are indicated by green dots. This is kinda like the progenitor to the open world Spider-Man games that Spider-Man 2 pioneered. Sure, you can tackle these bosses head on without exploring the city, but it's better to do these smaller levels so that you can grind for resources for the boss stages. The biggest caveat is that, like the other versions of this game, there's a 24-hour time limit, which is 24 minutes in game. I don't know why they decided to keep the actual time limit if they opened the city up, but it's not that unfair. If you defeat a boss, you get a unique password, and when you use that password to go back to where you left off, the timer resets. And if you die in the game, you can respawn where you left off, meaning there are no lives. So there is wiggle room to understand each of the game's mechanics. Each time you die, the game has a game over animation screen that has its own set of dialogue, which is so cool. There's even a bit of variety for these game over screens, but it's another example of how hard Grey Matter went with this game. There's a pinball level that doesn't really matter until later in the game, but if you lose in that level, Spider-Man gets dropped off at the police station in a giant ball. That's great.
We got something special for you, Sarge.
Spider-Man, huh? This ought to make the chief happy. Put him in a holding cell until I can call the feds and find out what they want to do with him. What a night! All this talk about nuking the city's got this town crazier than usual. And that's saying a lot.
Yeah, sure, Sarge.
And tell the guy guarding the cell to keep his eyes open. These super guys are some slippery customers.
Whatever you say.
Gotcha!
Other than fighting bosses and defeating crime throughout the city, you can collect comic book covers that are placed on certain levels. Their locations vary from the middle of the level, somewhere randomly, and worst of all, past the end of the level. So you can finish a level, notice the cover, and by the time you process it, you already left the level. On the bright side, if you miss out on getting the cover, the level is marked with a blue Spider-Man card. So with that in mind, you'd assume that you can collect a bunch of covers, get a password, and then come back later to get the rest? Nope. Once you return to the game, all of your covers are wiped from the gallery, and that fucking sucks. The levels that had those covers are marked with a blue Spider-Man card, but considering that this game has a time limit, what's the point? I mean, the comic covers have their own problems, but the game encourages you to fight petty crime around the city, but enforces a time limit? A time limit that's so superfluous that it resets when you return with a password. So if the time limit resets, why can't you just save those comic covers? I have no idea if there's a special thing for getting them all, but with the way the game handles it, I don't see the point really. If you collect these comic book covers, you can access them in the gallery, but they are 16-bit renditions of these covers. You can't even look at them individually either, which sucks. I'm surprised that they didn't digitize them or use the city's capabilities. But these 16-bit renditions are kind of cursed in their presentation. At times they don't resemble the actual covers and look horrifying, but it was cool getting an Amazing Spider-Man 300 cover in the Venom boss level. It was nice to see these covers in the game, and they were fun to collect. But to lose them every time you boot up the game, and the fact that they weren't the best looking, sucks. It feels like lost potential, and what's weird is that if you continue after dying, they aren't removed from your collection. So why does it only happen when you use your passport to get back in? Weird. The game has a balancing issue. During the patrol stages, enemy damage is not detrimental, which makes these levels relatively easy, although the point of doing these stages is to collect web fluid and health before charging into the boss levels, so that makes sense. But when you actually do these boss battles, the enemies hit a bit harder and it's easier to get stun locked. But even then, I didn't get frustrated until the electro boss level. These electricity enemies are a pain in the ass and will follow you into the boss area, and that's ridiculous. It's just a weird difficulty curve that just comes out of nowhere. With that in mind, let's talk about the bosses. The bosses are cheap for the most part and will destroy you without an issue. So to beat these bosses, you have to play as cheap as they do. Stand in one spot and just farm damage until they die. This strategy works 9 out of 10 times. If you try webbing them, you'll end up dying, so there's no point in using webs, which is weird because it's a Spider-Man game, there's webs for a reason. The only weapon that's worth a damn is the web shield, and that came in clutch during the final level. The only fun boss battles are Sandman and Venom, and that's because they're anti-boss battles. For Sandman, I thought you had to fight him or at least weaken him with the fire hydrants, and I kept dying over and over. When I finally hit the fire hydrant at the right time, that ended the boss battle immediately, and all I could muster was, "What?" And then I started laughing. Keep in mind that you fight gorillas at the park area, so for the actual boss to be that easy was funny in a cosmic kind of way. For Venom, the same thing happened. I treated the boss like a normal boss because, why wouldn't I, right? But no matter what I did to him, he regained his health. It wasn't until I swung around that I found out that I had to climb up the church, and that started phase 2 of the boss battle. Then I had to climb up to the roof inside the church and ring both church bells at the same time while Venom hounds you. And if you don't get to both of them fast enough, one of the bells stops, so that was fun. After doing that, the anti-boss battle ends and you're rewarded with another Oscar award-winning cutscene. It was kind of annoying to learn on the fly, but it's cool that they changed it up here and there. Variety never hurts. After defeating Mysterio, he forces you to go to another room to get his key to the bomb, and in typical Mysterio fashion, he traps you in the aforementioned pinball machine. The lizard boss has 2 phases, in which he turns back into his human form, and then out of nowhere, he animorphs back into his lizard form. You could cheese him the same way you did during his first phase, him anamorphing was funny.
I'm sorry, Kurt. I know you can't help the awful chemical reaction that keeps turning you into the lizard, and you can't help what you do when you transform, but I had to stop you. Kurt, are you okay? Oh, where am I? What am I doing here? Spider-Man. What's going on? It's a long story, Kurt. You might say I ran into you while I was looking for something down here. A key. Could this be the key? Where did that come from? I don't know. I never saw it before. Well, here, you take it. Thanks, Kurt. This will help me clobber the Kingpin. What's happening to me? Help! Oh no! He's the lizard again! Sorry, Kurt. It looks like I'm going to have to take you out again. If I can.
The final level is crazy in how stupid and funny it is. So you do the normal thing of going through the level, and then BAM! Immediately it turns into a boss rush mode. Each gauntlet has 2 bosses, and they're placed above and below you. So if you key on one of them, you could cheese them without issue, but if you activate both of them, you're fucked. On the bright side, after each gauntlet, the game gives you health and web refills, which makes the gauntlet fair until you disarm the bomb. Then every enemy on the planet starts to jump you, and before you realize the strat for success, you're curb stomped out of existence. The bomb needs all keys to disarm, as you'd expect, but the order in which they are placed is randomized, which is horrifying considering you're being jumped. So you have to use the web shield, which eats a chunk of your web fluid, and keep putting each key until one works, and repeat the process. After you somehow figure that out, you get to heal up and refill your web fluid before taking on the Kingpin. All you have to do is web shield and jump kick him to oblivion until he dies. Unlike the animated series game, you can use your web shield to give you an edge, but the other weapons in general are pretty useless. Swinging across levels is pretty seamless, and there's not a lot of space for error. It's probably the most fun I've had swinging in a 2D plane. I also think it's cool that at the end of one level, you can see Venom lurking in the background. It was pretty creepy and it caught me off guard. It was really cool. I liked it. I love the little details that they put in this game. But I want to show you this before wrapping up my review on the game. The Amazing Spider-Man vs. the Kingpin is really good and the best game out of the batch. Not only is this game ambitious with its cutscenes and clean soundtrack, but the game is just fun to play. I think it's funny that the manual claims that the rats and bats are impossible to beat, so you should avoid them, when the bats can clip the environment backroom style and damage you. Like, if you knew they were a problem, why keep them in the game? Unless you're doing a little trolling, which is more sus than a character from Among Us. The game does have its share of problems that irk the living hell out of me, but I would be lying to you if I said they soured me on the game. A semi-world open Spider-Man game with an enforced time limit, what more can you ask? Ambitious, yet flawed. The Amazing Spider-Man vs. the Kingpin on the Sega CD gets a 4 out of 5. I think this is the first time in this season so far, actually. Wow, that sucks. Or maybe I'm too harsh, who knows. Special thanks to Neosci for suffering through one of the games today and being an IT king. Hopefully, he won more bot on me. He makes great retrospective videos on a variety of game franchises, so if you like those kind of videos, give him a sub. This batch of games was frustrating to go through, especially considering half of the games that I touched on were games that I covered during the handheld era. I was excited to try out most of these games, and they ended up either being mediocre or depressing, and I'm shocked that the Sega CD version of a bad game ended up being great. But this ends the 2D era of Spider-Man games, and unlike certain gaming icons, Spider-Man had an interesting transition into 3D. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video and want to see more, like the video so you can be seen by the almighty algorithm, and subscribe to the channel. And most of all, I'll thank my patrons, Leocrit, Hachi, and Retroroy for supporting the channel, and for $1 a month, your name can show up right here. Love you guys and Shalom.